Hi everyone, and welcome to MZ Webinars. Thank you for joining us today, and we're going to be talking about the skills shortages that are around STEM and basically the problems that that's going to pose to you kind of locally. The host today is Andy Derman. He's our MZ's Managing Director, so welcome Andy. Before we get started, I'd just like to say if you have any questions as the webinar is going on, of course the presentation, can you just add them to the box which is on your control panel, and we'll try and answer those as best we can at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'd hand over to Andy. Good afternoon, Andy.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Hello from a rather dreary and slightly rainy Basingstoke in Hampshire. Some may say that's what it's like all the time, but sometimes we do see the sunshine. Anyway, hope this webinar finds you all very well, and thank you very much for joining us as we run through some of the highlights from a recent report we published that you may or may not have seen thus far. In terms of the plan for today, I would like to use this as an opportunity really just to share some of the key takeaways from the work we've done looking into the STEM employment picture, and use this as an opportunity really to reinforce some of the key messages that we've pulled out, particularly in terms of how we can dig into and understand the breadth of the challenge and the opportunity presented by a changing economy. And ultimately, our goal is very much about helping you as actors and agents of change to be suitably well informed on how best to address these challenges and opportunities as we go through. So the plan is really just to pull out some of the highlights from the report, share some takeaways, and I'll have a few items towards the end to point you towards. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics based economy is never out of the news. We hear a lot of content being published around some of the great challenges of aligning our labour market, and particularly around skill shortages, as Debbie had mentioned at the beginning here. We reference certainly in the report some CBI research highlighting just the sheer challenge of identifying suitably educated staff in the STEM field, and the fact that it's a real key barrier to recruiting and growing businesses in the field, and that employers who are certainly rely on these skills are really struggling to find the staff, and that has a real tangible cost on productivity in our economy. So I'm not necessarily going to go over all ground there. That's well aligned. Our focus really was about trying to get beneath the headlines and really start to understand, well, what does this mean in our communities, and ultimately, therefore, how can we solve that challenge? And really what we come on to talk about, and I'll pick out some highlights, is the fact that the problem, the STEM shortage, the STEM workforce shortage, the STEM education outcome shortage really is quite a broad term, and the real challenge for understanding how to solve the problem is first we need to understand the specifics of the problem, particularly as we dig into variations geographically, but also across the whole raft of occupations that fall into the broad STEM category, and ultimately the different industries that are seeking this talent and competing for a relatively small pool of workforce. And so our goal really was about helping you to understand how you can dig into the weeds, so you can then focus on actually the solutions that are relevant to that, and very much solving that why problem mentioned on screen here. So just to pick out a few highlights and really dig into a couple of those nuances really. And as I say, I'd very much encourage you to, if you haven't already, to find the report, download it. We will circulate it as a follow-up to this webinar in case you haven't seen it. But we go through a lot of detail there. But just to pick out a few highlights, well, where's the challenge coming from? well, first and foremost, it's a sheer pressure on the economy and the labour market. So we can see, if we look at the period 2003 to 2017, those occupations that are classified within the STEM grouping have far outstripped job growth in terms of non-STEM roles quite considerably, and that's a significant pressure. And that pressure is projected to certainly continue into the next few years, with STEM job growth forecasted to outstrip non-STEM job growth. And so that really sets the scene for why this has become such a challenging item. It's really a function of a changing economy. But understanding, as I say, the headlines is one thing, but really to solve these problems and understand how we can change that situation, we need to dig into the weeds and the detail that sit beneath those headlines. So we present in our report a few different dimensions. Here's an example, thinking about the localization element, that whilst STEM employment and STEM demand for STEM employment is pretty universal in its aggregate across the country, there are clearly areas and localities that have higher concentrations and higher demands than others. So this map, for example, draw your eye towards the yellower end of the scale, where there are real key clusters of employment, and you can see the table just picking out the top 10 highest employing local authorities in STEM roles. So you can see a concentration of the major cities and urban areas, but the Thames Valley region certainly comes through, and the wider city regions as well. So there's a concentration and a challenge in certain localities there. So geographically speaking, that helps us to zero in on where we might look to seek localized solutions where demand is greatest. And so, as we see there, it is a national problem in some senses, but actually solutions really come on the ground, and so knowing where those challenges are greatest is going to be the critical part to working out where to shape and deliver those solutions. Another dimension that we can think of is actually thinking about it from the perspective of industry demand for these roles. And so when we talk about industries, what we mean there is the types of companies or employers that are seeking that talent. We've used our proprietary industry clustering technique to build out a set of 49 different employment clusters based on the companies that are driving employment. And here are those 49 clusters ranked in order of highest proportion of workforce as in those STEM occupations. So you can see here towards the top of that list, digital, oil and gas, civil engineering, precision technology, but particularly digital and oil and gas. Really a significant chunk of the workforce is in those key STEM occupations. It's interesting to note here as we define our industry clusters, we have differentiated between what we call tradable clusters and local clusters. Tradable clusters in particular have a significantly higher percentage of workforce reliant on STEM occupations, and it is these tradable clusters that are really the agents for change and growth, particularly on a local level. So these tradable clusters are often highly exportable goods and industries and big drivers of growth locally, regionally and nationally. And so whilst we've seen that there's an aggregate acute demand for STEM occupations, I think the thing that's probably hurting the economy most and worrying employers most is it's in those industries that are really going to be the drivers of economic growth within a region and the nation that are exposed in greater terms to STEM occupation demand. And so not solving this problem will disproportionately hurt the economy. So in that respect, we need to make sure not only geographically we're understanding where the problems are acutest, but actually start to think about how that differentiates by different industry. And each industry will have its different flavor of STEM demand. So obviously the oil and gas industry will take a slightly different view on what occupations and where the demand is amongst the STEM occupations compared to digital, which will obviously be significantly more focused around IT and technology as opposed to engineering and mathematics related occupations. It's also very helpful to look at the economy in terms of salaries. Salaries do give us a good view on both a sense of extreme shortages, and certainly where labour is more difficult to access, that will drive up wage and salary. And so it gives us a clue as to where the demand certainly outstrips supply. But also is a great mechanism for us to help promote, certainly to future talent, the great value of investing their education efforts into higher paying occupations. And so salary can be quite a key determinant of career choice. And what we tend to find here is a lot of those occupations that are largely classified within the STEM category tend to be at the higher earning end of the radar, which on one level, again, reflects the challenge in recruiting talent in these fields, but should provide a firm grounding to promote these career options based on returns on investment to education and ultimately earnings power and potential. As you can see, the vast majority certainly fit above the national average or median in terms of wage, and quite considerably there. So the hope is that, with this kind of knowledge, we can really monetize the incentive to train in these roles and hopefully affect the through flow of talent. So we've talked here in terms of the types of locations that are driving demand. So that gives us one lens. We've also talked about the types of industries that are seeking that talent and how that might shape an understanding of the specific needs. The third dimension then we looked at was through the lens of salary, looking at those occupations themselves and using salary as an indicator as to where the pain points may lie greatest in that. So that gives us a really rich view, and of course, by having those dynamics, we can look at those dynamics on a location by location basis as well. So it gives us a real sharp viewpoint of different aspects of STEM demand, and starting certainly to fulfill that piece I mentioned right at the beginning of trying to unpick, look beneath the headlines and really start to dig into the weeds. But we can dig further for sure. And one of the key elements when we start to think about the STEM labour market and a lot of the change that's happening, the rapid change that's happening within our labour markets, is naturally this lies in a level of detail yet further, particularly when we're starting to think about the key skills that are in demand. And so we've been able to map through our existing job postings data to look beneath the headlines of the occupations and those 38 STEM occupations that we've classified into that wider group, and really start to think about the types of specific skills that employers are seeking, so we can get a sense of how we can start to not just move from a level of understanding, but ultimately start to think about how skills development and education development can really help us solve this challenge. And so to do so, we need to look at what employers are seeking within the specific confines of the different occupation types, and understand what's common across the piece versus what's specific to different aspects of that STEM grouping. So we can see here, for example, a different set of groupings that a real common factor is management skills being quite critical across the piece, irrespective of which STEM grouping we're looking at, or subgrouping, should I say. But of course, as we dig into more specialist areas like the IT roles, we can start to see very specific programming languages coming through there, versus looking in other areas where we can see testing and analysis as key skills that employers are demanding. So again, just thinking about how we change this from one of understanding in general to really exploring how we solve these challenges. Well, we need to dig into the weeds and the detail here. So the skills dimension really does give us a sense of how we can solve the problem, not just what the problem is. So those are the key dimensions and certainly the key themes that we picked out of the report. And ultimately, it's certainly from our experience and the work we're doing in the field that one challenge is first framing the problem. The next is about really digging into the weeds of the detail so we can work out how to solve the challenge. And that's definitely where we want to focus our work in the education, economic development and employment space, and are already doing so. And so we really wanted to showcase to you just how important it is to access granular labor market intelligence to really work out not just what the problem is, but how we solve it. And that's definitely where we would love to help and love to hear from you and learn from your own experiences in this arena. The key challenge then is not just about having the data, but acting upon it. And I'll come on to talk about that in a moment, but ultimately it's how individual stakeholders in this environment can start to shape their activities. How can colleges, universities, LEPs and local authorities, for example, really start to shape their interventions and activities around the specific needs? And then not just individually, but thinking about how we can all work together, particularly around place, and particularly with the opportunities that the industrial strategy and the need to localize that can really give us a framework to focus in on. We do have some resources coming soon. So I actually caught up with some of my sector lead colleagues recently and invited them to present a bit more of an understanding of what some of the findings from the report mean for their sectors and how their sectors can and are addressing some of these challenges. And we will be circulating that video very soon, so do keep an eye out for that. I'd also like to point you towards the conference we have coming up, our annual conference, where we will be exploring very similar types of themes and really digging into the weeds with a whole range of great speakers and case studies of the need to really define, develop, and ultimately deliver these emergent skills of the future. So a really exciting conference planned. Visit the MZ website. You'll be able to click through and see the agenda and the great speakers we already have lined up from organizations like Centre for Cities, City and Guilds, and even a speaker from the University of Sydney who will be joining us, which is very exciting. And so I'd very much encourage you to have a look at the details there and sign up for the conference in May, which we're all very excited about. So thank you very much. That I just wanted to, as I say, just share the key themes. As I say, as a follow-up to this session, we will be circulating the report. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, please do read that. And also, as I say, keep an eye out for the video, which is coming very soon. I've had a chance to see it. There's some great content in there, and we will circulate that very soon. That's what I wanted to cover today. So, Debbie, if I might invite you back into this conversation, perhaps we can see if there are any questions that we can answer.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. We haven't really got any questions. We just had one which said, do we have a copyright on the phrase dig beneath the headlines and dig amongst the weeds?
Sorry, I'm full of cliches.
So perhaps that's something we should look into.
Andy dig beneath the headlines Derman. That's my new name.
Other than that, we haven't got any questions. And thank you so much for taking the webinar today. So that will be all. Thank you all for listening and for attending the webinar, and we look forward to you joining us again. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone.